So I'm Darren. I've been working remotely and across the spectrum of remote for over 14 years. So it was a lot harder to work remotely when Edge was the fastest mobile connection technology available and laptop batteries lasted about 14 and a half minutes. Those were fun days. We've come a long way. And I will say, to everyone's point, what's happening right now is very much not remote work. This is kind of a crisis driven work from home where you don't even have some of the perks of remote, like going to a cafe. And I'll address some of that. In fact, at GitLab, we don't say you have to work from home. We just say there's no office to commute to. And we'll reimburse co-working fees or external office fees. And about a fifth of our company actually takes us up on that on a monthly basis. And so we have about a fifth of our company now that they themselves, even though we're all remote, they're in a strange predicament because their home is not amenable to remote work and they're used to going to a co-working space or external office, and they've kind of been shoehorned. And so they're getting kind of a taste of this, what the broader world is seeing. So with that, I'm going to punch over to the presentation. I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for Q&A. I want to make sure that what I'm saying is directly applicable to your teams. I know your time is valuable. So I just want to give you an overview of where I'm coming from and some lessons that we've learned at GitLab. And then I'll open it up. Any question, any scenario, nothing's taboo. GitLab is extremely transparent. And I love that about their values. You can ask me literally anything. I've seen a lot. I haven't seen this, but we'll get through it. And so I invite any questions. So with that, I'm going to start sharing here. So the point here is to give you a foundational toolkit to thrive as a remote team, because a lot of you are operating with remote teams right now, and you might not feel like you're thriving. And it's like, it's one thing to stumble through it and operate as a remote team. It's another thing to thrive as a remote team to the point where you see long-term advantages to doing it that way instead of going back to the office. And so I want to get you from point A to point B, with point B being we're thriving as a remote team. We're actually more efficient and happier this way. One of the core questions I want to keep in mind here is, what do you and your teams need in order to effectively work remotely? And a lot of companies and team leaders will immediately go to tools, especially if you're thrust into it. Like, what is the tool that we need? What are the tools? What are the apps? And that's definitely a part of it. But as you'll see, so much of what holds the glue that holds GitLab together, over 1,200 people across 65 countries, no offices, it really starts with culture, process, and mentality. And that is the hardest thing to wrap your head around when you're already in high alert. So we're going to talk about how to get grounded on that and set your team up for success. I've introduced myself somewhat, but I want to give you some POV on what I do at GitLab. So as I mentioned, we're 1,200 plus people across over 65 countries, the world's largest all remote company. We have no offices from inception. We've been remote. So if you want to visit our executive team, you're going to have to make an arrangement to go visit them at their apartment, or once the world gets back normal, at a local Starbucks. If you look up GitLab on Google Maps, it will very sadly take you to a UPS store. And we've had a lot of people comment on that address. Say, where's GitLab? And so that's where we get our taxes. That's it. We are the world's largest all remote organization, and that enables us to share learnings of successes, of failures, of iteration. We've been remote since the beginning. The three co-founders were in various countries, so we were remote from the start. We came to Y Combinator. They forced us to get an office because it's the thing you do, and within 3 days, no one came. Everyone stopped showing up, and work still got done. So we were like, well, let's just stop paying money for this lease and just keep working. And that's how we became all remote. We didn't set out to do it. It just made sense to spend money on people, tools, and technology instead of real estate. Pretty simple. And the fabric of that was built from the foresight to document everything, even the values and culture at the very beginning, so that me joining 6 years later, I get all the benefits of the founders starting that when they did. And so we'll talk a little bit about how important that is and the long tail benefits of that. We actually just produced a remote work report this month, and it's linked here, and Ted, we can send this around, but I would encourage everybody to look at this. Crazy enough, we actually envisioned this late last year, well before COVID-19, and we actually started polling in late January. And so this wasn't directly tied to it, but it's more valuable than ever. This polled over 3,000 people globally that already work remotely across the spectrum of remote. So some people are in the minority. Most of their team goes into an office and they're of the 10% that doesn't. Some people are more 50-50 in a pure hybrid remote, intentionally hybrid remote setting. And then some of them were all remote. And we definitely see a massive increase of companies going that direction. And I think what's happening now is only going to increase that. We've always said that one of the big reasons to go all remote is it significantly de-risks your company because you're less susceptible to socioeconomic pressures. For example, companies based in London never saw Brexit coming and they have no control over it, and it now permanently impacts their business. San Francisco, Stripe never saw the real estate increase coming, and now they're having to relocate to South San Francisco, and that's not free. So by decoupling geography and work as a business, you're actually removing a lot of risk. And of course, with this health crisis now, companies that are in tier 3 areas like Milan struggling a lot more than areas where it's not as widespread yet. So for leaders, why look at this? It gives you a lot of stats on what makes remoters tick, what are the reasons that they love doing it, and what are the challenges still in place that you need to be aware of as a leader to address. I covered this, but just to give you some idea of how big GitLab is, we are 1,200 people, but it's open core, and our remote knowledge is fully open sourced. And so we have tons of contributors that contribute. And in fact, the GitLab values page, which is going to be increasingly important, absolutely vital for a remote team. We actually have outside contributors make suggestions on how to make our values better. Sometimes it's just a typo or a formatting cleanup, but sometimes it's some really good substantiators. And it has helped us grow as a remote organization by empowering everyone to contribute. And I'd say within your teams, this is really important. As people get spread out, and especially if you're in a hybrid scenario where there's two classes of people, there's the class that goes into the office and then there's the class that doesn't. No matter what you do, that will always be a two-class operation, and you need to just be honest about it. There may be business reasons why you need it, but don't just ignore it, because the people outside of the office will absolutely know it. And there is, I have seen, and our report shows this too, the amount of isolation and mental health issues and the risk of the fear of missing out goes up exponentially for remoters that are working with people that are in the office. But at all remote team, when we're all on a level playing field, there's no office to miss out on. There's no physical happy hours to miss out on. So that goes down precipitously in all remote teams. I'm not saying isolation doesn't happen, and we'll touch on that. But just be cognizant of that. If you're operating a hybrid remote team, you need to take intentional steps on addressing that. And to a founder's point earlier, have empathy for the people that are not in the office. A lot of people they work remotely because they don't want to commute to the office every day, but that doesn't mean they're not human. And every now and again, they'll miss some of that interaction. So let's talk about the challenges of remote. We definitely believe that it's the future, but when external forces are rushing its implementation, there are going to be issues. Here are the common questions we're seeing. How do I manage a remote team? What tools do we need? How much communication is too much? And who is in charge of our remote transition? And for that last question, if you're not asking that, you definitely should be. A lot of companies just assume that operations will handle it, or maybe the people group or HR group will handle it. And what I've seen is that in reality, it's kind of a combination of both. And one of the things I'll touch on in a bit is it's really important, if you're being forced into this and you're not really ready for it, it's important to establish a remote leadership team. And it can be cross-functional if you don't have time to hire someone else in. But there needs to be a task force on just getting the remote transition right. If you just assume you can leave your usual operations in the office and then move over to remote and everything is just going to naturally work and you don't need feedback mechanisms, that's going to create a lot of friction in a time of where there's already a lot of dysfunction, and you don't want that to be added on. And this is just a glimpse at like the entire world is going remote overnight, which has presented an interesting scenario for GitLab and for everyone else. But companies that were staunchly against this, like we're strongly investing, we have a quote in-office culture, whatever that means. Like now that's out the window. So what has happened is the global recognition of remote has been accelerated by at least 5 to 10 years. We have immediately moved beyond let's have an argument about the pros and cons of remote. Like we're well past that. Like there is no point in arguing it anymore. It is now business critical to just get it right because of the scenario we're in. One thing I want to point out though is I'm here to help you and answer questions on the here and now, but I want you to keep in mind the infrastructure that you lay now will have long tail benefits long after the world gets back to normal. And what I mean by that is if you have people working even in the same office building, but on different floors, they are remote to each other. And so it's worth laying the remote infrastructure, even for floors 3 and 5, to communicate more seamlessly and to make sure that something doesn't get lost in the ether, and to make sure that someone outside of that, or if they were sick that day, whatever, has context whenever they come back in and jump in midstream. And so the things you put in place now will actually have longer tail benefits. So it's worth doing it right now. It will make your company, what I like to say is it will make your company more remote fluent going forward. And as a smaller company, now is the time to do it, because it gets exponentially more difficult to do this as you grow. I've actually had conversations with some huge companies, and they're trying to do this. Suddenly they have tens of thousands of people working remote, and they never laid the groundwork from a documentation and process and culture standpoint. And it's an absolute nightmare. So do it early, do it intentionally. And as your company scales, the benefits will become outsized. And in this moment in time, any of your competitors that didn't bother to do this, you'll run circles around them just from an efficiency standpoint. All right, the three big challenges: workspace, comms, and mindset. And this is primarily for people that have been thrust into it. As we had already heard discussed, what if my home isn't designed to be an office? What if I actually want to leave my house? This presents a challenge to me. Comms, we never thought about structuring our communication. We're just all in an office. We all just tap each other on the shoulder. It just happens. It spontaneously happens. The biggest thing here is mindset. Like, how do I do this? What do we do? What's going to happen if this happens? Core advice here: break all the rules if you need to. Some things are going to seem weird until they don't. And then it's just going to become second nature. Yesterday, we had a GitLab all hands call. We had over 600 people in a Zoom chat, and there's no moderator. We all just know instinctively when we can pipe up, when we need to let someone else talk. We have an agenda doc attached to that meeting. And so everyone is able to type their question in. They see when somebody's verbalizing it. They see when it's their turn. It just works. I had a conversation with someone coming from a co-located space, and they could not ever imagine that you could have 600 people at one time and have an effective meeting, but it just becomes second nature. It seems awkward until it doesn't. I want to share some best practices from our trials and tribulations. And on the break old habits front, we can talk more in depth about this. If any of this, I'm going to go through this quickly, but if any of it interests you, feel free to bring up a specific question on it, and I'd love to screen share or dive in. Every question should be a link. And so what I mean by that is it is really important for your team to start documenting process now. Document everything now. The way a GitLabber thinks is like this. If you get asked a question in Slack, you should be able to answer that person with a link, literally just paste them a link. If you cannot do that, and you need to go find the answer, it has never been documented before, that's fine. Go find the answer the person, and then immediately document it in the handbook, whatever that single source of truth is, with the thought being you're paying it forward. Anyone who has this question henceforth will just be able to query the handbook and find the answer instead of bothering anyone in the company. Now, as a 10-person company, maybe that doesn't get you a lot of efficiency. But as you scale to 1,200 people, that is 1,200x less shoulder taps daily on just basic questions. And if you're in a situation now where we don't have a handbook, we don't have a single source of truth, hire a documentarian, hire a scribe to just shadow every meeting, just be there to contextualize and put this down in one centralized place. There are a ton of freelance writers out there right now with nothing to do, and they would be an amazing asset to your team. Journalists and former journalists are amazing for this because they think in terms of telling a story. They don't just transcribe like a robot. They will listen for stories, format it, contextualize it, and get it down in one place. So a lot of people say, I don't have time to document. There's the old adage of, if you don't have time to do it right, when are you going to have time to do it over? And this is a core part of ensuring that a remote team is on the same page and can get to the same page if they're not, by having this single source of truth. Quick anecdote on how we use Slack. We actually expire our Slack messages after 90 days. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but this is one of the key forcing functions to doing remote right and to making your entire team think remote first. So we're why would you do that? Because if you don't do that, work will happen in Slack. And here's the problem with work happening in Slack. It never ends in Slack. You either have to send it to a client, you have to take it somewhere. Like you can't just ship off Slack. So you always have to port something, which is massively inefficient. And so we want the work to begin where it needs to end up, which in our case is in a GitLab issue. So we expire the messages so that people know they can't just hit Control F and query something that happened in Slack. It's going to disappear. The side benefit of that is we use Slack pretty much exclusively for informal communication, which is one of the biggest gaps that people are trying to fill if they're going from in-office to remote. What I mean by that is like, oh, I don't have a water cooler anymore. Where can I just talk about things with people that aren't related to work? Slack is perfect for that. You'll see in the screenshot, we have a channel called In the Parenthood. It's just for parents that want to join and talk about how crazy their kids are. And I'm not kidding. It's like, I have a 7-year-old that won't get dressed in the morning. Does anybody also have a 7-year-old, like with any tips on corralling these crazy beings? And we'll talk about that. And it's wild because that's something that probably would not get talked about in office, but it's totally cool to talk about it remotely. And so we have more intimate bonds and more informal communication because we structure this, but it takes intentionality. If you just throw your team remote and no one creates channels to talk about anything other than work, guess what? No one will talk about anything other than work, and they'll get massively isolated and they'll start missing the social interaction. So the difference is you have to be intentional about giving people a place and a portal and a medium to talk about things that they otherwise normally would. Create the virtual water cooler for them, and then that's where people will go to engage on that. Meeting organizers and DRIs. I touched on this a little bit, but at GitLab, you cannot have a meeting without a Google Doc agenda attached to it. If it doesn't, and you get an invite for that, you can just immediately hit decline. And it's like no harm done, because you can't waste my time if there's not an agenda. This is not an inclusive way to have a meeting. It doesn't allow people to contribute asynchronously, so we're just not going to do it. Every meeting has to have an agenda. This acts as a forcing function on, do we really need to have a meeting? Because the burden of having a meeting is very high. First of all, you have to add an agenda. Second of all, either you have to document it or you have to find somebody to join the meeting to document it for you. And then at the end of it, you have to document any business-wide takeaways in the handbook, wherever that single source of truth is, your wiki, whatever you want to call it. That's a high burden. And so we don't have a lot of meetings because we would rather just do things asynchronously. Like, let's just start a GitLab issue, tag the people that need to be tagged. If I miss someone, someone else in the tag will know it. They'll tag the other people. Let's just start having a conversation that can span the globe in time zones instead of trying to freak out. Let's get somebody up at 2 in the morning and have a synchronous meeting. We try to avoid that at all costs. And by making meetings hard to have, it acts as a good forcing function to start doing things differently. I'll leave these other links. We can discuss these if I mentioned the co-working space as well. If anybody has additional questions on that, you're welcome to ask at the end. How do we make all remote work? I mentioned these to some degree, but there's huge value in having a single source of truth. If you don't have this now, ask me a question about it. I'll help you get started on it. Absolutely essential. Embracing asynchronous workflows. If you do not do this early, you're doomed. And the one thing I would say is time zones are a real bear when you're 3 to 10 people. They actually get massively easier at scale on an all remote team. And here's what I mean by that. We have people across 65 countries. So most major time zones and even some random time zones are covered. So now it's almost every team has someone falling over by 2 or 4 hours where work can just easily happen around the globe. It's not like, oh, shoot, there's no one within 8 or 12 hours of me. This project isn't going to get moved forward for half a day. So stick with it. I would encourage you to hire people far away from you. It's going to hurt early on. And then as you hire more people in between, you're going to love it. And it becomes a lot easier than time zones at scale for co-located companies where someone always has to compromise on the meeting time. And building trust and community. All the tools in the world are going to be meaningless if you don't lead with a culture of trust instead of one of micromanagement and fear. There's plenty of that already, and it is felt in your teams. And it's weird, but if you're a worker in a remote situation and you feel like your leader is over your shoulder, even in your home, it's actually worse than them being over your shoulder in an office. It has compounded negative effects. So don't do that. Handbook-first documentation. This is a glimpse at our handbook. If you printed it out, it would be over 5,000 pages, but here's the secret. It didn't start as 5,000 pages. It started as one. And I would say if you're in a situation where you do not have a handbook, GitLab Pages is an amazing tool to build it. If you want to get started quickly, Notion works. There's also a program called Ask Almanac. Pretty new, but also really good at this. And they've crowdsourced a lot so that you can go grab a guide from someone else that does it and then change it to fit your business. Really cool model. So check them out if you haven't seen them. And it start out by just creating an FAQ. Who's the DRI for an IT issue? Who's the DRI for an HR issue? These things, if you could normally just go tap someone on the shoulder and you can't now, write that down. Secondarily, how to make this work is have a feedback mechanism for your entire team to say, hey, I don't know who to go to for this. There should be no shame in that. And you'll see common threads of people don't know where to go. We should document answers to that. That's how you prioritize what to document first. Async workflows, the easiest way to get people in a mindset of embracing async is how would I move this project forward? How would I do this next piece of work if literally everyone else in the company was asleep? Now that's never going to work for everything, but if you start that with that thought in everything, you will force your brain to think, okay, what kind of context can I add to this project? Where can I put this? Where can I document this? How can I communicate this such that whenever someone else wakes up, they can take it from here? Anything you can do to stop the torturous loop of synchronous meetings, it will help you massively as you scale. This isn't applicable now, but the nonlinear workday, once the world gets back to normal, is something that's really cool. It allows you to kind of embrace your peak productivity time. So me, for example, I love going outside, love being with my family, love being out of work in the daylight, and love working when it's dark and I can't do anything else anyway. And so I work really strange schedules. A lot of people will say, stick to the routine if you're going from office to remote. And I would say if you're really used to it, that's probably a good place to acclimate. But as you get into it, I would say experiment with breaking the routine and finding a routine that may work better for you from a productivity standpoint. Transitioning to remote, I think I heard this mentioned earlier. The easiest way to do this and mean it is to get the executives out of the office. If you pull all of the executives out for at least a month, ideally a quarter, you will immediately see what communication gaps there are, what voids need to be filled. And that will become your priority list of how do we become remote first. Because if the executive team is out, at some point, the information flow going up or back down will start to break down and you'll see what they are. There's no Band-Aid type of solution. And if you're lucky enough to have an EA, I would say the secondarily what they should be doing is documenting problem points and friction points as the executive team is remote and helping document what is our roadmap to filling these gaps look like. Our utility belt, it doesn't look exactly like that, but that's a fun graphic. Our tool stack is really minimal, and I would encourage people that if you're being transitioned into remote inadvertently, minimize the tool stack. The last thing you want to do on top of all this crazy chaos is like, here's a new tool. If you can avoid that, avoid it. We stick with Zoom, Slack, GitLab, and Gmail. We have a few divisions of the company, like our marketing ops, that uses Marketo and Salesforce. But for the entire company, we really stick to those 4 things. And Slack actually has video. So you could simplify it one further if you didn't want to use Zoom and just use Slack for video. GitLab is our async tool of choice. If you can implement an async tool or you have one that can operate like that, I would say lean into that for sure. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to open source all of our knowledge. So I've stood up over 30 guides on how we do everything remotely. You would need a lot of time to read that, but I have cut down a lot of it into 2 starter guides on emergency kits, one for leaders, one for workers. And we can share those links around. Tech and make sure you get those after this call. But if you want to see all the guides, they're at allremote.info. There's the hashtag and my Twitter handle. You're welcome to ask me questions after this. And with that, I would love to open it up for questions.